Hi everyone, it's Tuesday, February 23rd, 2021, and today you're going to be working on Go Math 6.5, lesson 6.5. It's called Common Denominators and Equivalent Fractions. Yesterday you guys talked about how to find factors, and finding factors is the kind of the base or the fundamental of what you need in order to help you find equivalent fractions, as well as helping you find common denominators. So today your objective is to be able to find a common denominator or a least common denominator to write equivalent fractions. You also have in your packet of materials that I passed out to you, you have a fraction bar, kind of like a picture. You can cut those out and you can use it, or you can just look at it as a reference sheet. You don't have to use it. And also, last time I gave you guys a link to the math manipulatives. The fraction bars are also on there, so you guys can use and manipulate that as well to help you. For our problem of the day today, it is talking about what is a reasonable estimate. And we've been talking about estimate all year long of 1/12 and 7/8. So go ahead and pause and go over what the answer would be. And you should have gotten an answer of about 1. Okay. All right. Moving on. So in your book, you should be on page 269. Make sure you hold it up to the camera so Ms. Rupa can see that you are ready to go. And again, that essential question of how can you rewrite a pair of fractions so that they have a common denominator? Let's go ahead and unlock the problem. If someone can go ahead and read that, you can pause the video here. Thank you to whoever read. You can use a common denominator, and common denominator is a really important vocabulary term. You know, we just started this lesson and you've already heard this word many times. Or sometimes you can think of it as a common multiple of 2 or more denominators to write fractions that name the same part of a whole. So there's many ways that you can do this. So the first way, or this first method that you can use, is called multiply the denominators. Okay. So remember, the way that I remember when I do fractions, and you know, we've been doing this all year long, is trying to think of mnemonic devices, ways in which we have these hard, content vocabulary that we have to memorize, but what are ways in which we can make it easier for ourselves? So I always remember in fractions that denominator, that D in denominator, I always think of as D down, okay? So the number that is down or down below, right, is the denominator. You have the numerator on top and the denominator on bottom. So think to yourself, okay, if you divide 1/3 into fourths and divide each fourth into thirds, each of the wholes will be divided into the same parts. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you what that would look like. And you should be doing this in your book as well. So again, we're going to divide each of the thirds. The first one I'm going to divide into fourths. So 4 equal sections here. I'm going to do dotted lines to show how they would be split up. I know it's really hard to do that with the stylus, but just bear with me as you guys can see what I'm talking about here. So I'm dividing this into 4 equal parts, okay? And I will continue to do that. Maybe dotting it will be easier. Yeah, okay. I'll do dots. Okay, and I'll continue to split that. And one more time. Sorry, it's a little off, but you get the point. So here's my dividing each part, each third into fourths. And when I do that, I get how many sections, okay? And then same here. I'm going to divide the fourths into thirds. So this time, let's see if this dashes will work better here. Yep, it kind of does. Okay, so I do that here. Okay. And once you do that, you'll see that you have 12 sections, okay? So how did I do that, right? Well, one way you can do that is you can multiply denominators to find a common denominator. So if I have a fraction of 1/3 and I have a fraction with 1/4, I take the 3 and the 4 and I multiply that together, and that gives me 12. So where I write 1/3 and 1/4 as equivalent fractions using this common denominator. So what would I get for 1/3? You got it, 4/12. And what would I get for 1/4? You got it, 3/12. Okay? All right, so that's one method. The second method we'll be getting into is at the bottom of page 269, and it's called use a list. Okay, much like we did yesterday with our factors, you're going to make a list, and you're going to make a list of the first 8 non-zero multiples of 3 and 4, and you're going to do the same with starting with 3 and then moving on to 4. So we have 3, 6, 9 already there for you. Then 12, 15, 18, 21, 24. Then we do 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, and 32. Okay. So what you're now going to do is you're going to go in and you're going to circle the common multiples, the ones that they have in common. So we see that they both have 12, so I'm going to go ahead and circle 12. They both have 24 and 24 over here. Okay, so I'm going to use one of the common multiples as a common denominator to write equivalent fractions. 1/3, or I could write it as 4/12. Okay, or I could have written this if I chose 24ths as 8/24. Okay, for 1/4, same thing. I could have chosen 12th and you should have gotten 3/12, or if you chose 24ths, you would have gotten 6/24. So both gardens can have either 12 or they can have 24 sections. Go ahead and discuss as a class. They explain what a common denominator of two fractions represents. What does that mean? Okay, so that's how you find a common denominator, but the other method you can also use is always trying to find the least common denominator, right? So when you're finding the least common denominator of two or more fractions, you want to find the least common multiple. So we just did that when we're listing, and we had 12 and 24, but instead of going with 24, you would stick with the one that's less. So we would have just stuck with 12, okay? So finding the least common denominator of two fractions like 3/4 and 1/6, again, you're going to look at the denominator, and we're going to look at listing out the multiples of those numbers again. So we're going to use the least common denominator to write an equivalent fraction for each fraction. So we're going to find the least common multiple, and then I'm going to just kind of list out a bunch of numbers. Start with 4, counting by 4s, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. I think I'm good stopping there. Same with 6, okay? 6, 12, 18, 24, and I didn't even have to go that far, right? Automatically, the first one that comes up is 12. They both have 12 in common, and that is the least common multiple that they have. That's the first one that I encountered. I know there's other ones along the way, but 12 was the first one, so therefore it's considered the least. So the least common denominator for 3/4 and 1/6 is 12. When you're using the least common denominator, you want to make sure you write an equivalent fraction for each fraction. So you go back to the original fraction, which is 3/4, and you want to change that into 12s. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you're always multiplying the same number for both the numerator and the denominator. And when I do that, you should have gotten an answer of, you got it, 9/12. And for 1/6, here you're going to think to yourself, well, what number am I multiplying by to get me to 12s? 6 times what would give me 12? And we know that's 2. So if I do that, if I use that in the denominator, I also need to do the same for my numerator. And that would give me an answer of, thank you, 2/12. Okay, so now you see that 3/4 can also be written as 9/12, and 1/6 can be written as 2/12. So fractions have many different names for themselves just because they can be written as 3/4 doesn't mean that that's the only number that it can be. It can also be many different other fractions, and they are all equivalent to one another. Okay, so like I said, especially in math, there's many different ways of doing this. So here's another way for you guys to do it. And remember, pick the one that works best for you. So the way that we're going to be talking about right now is using prime factors. Okay, so when you're using prime factors to find the common denominator, for example, 5/8 and 7/20, we're going to write an equivalent fraction for each fraction. So here's step one. You're going to write each denominator as a product of its prime factors. So this is where the factors from yesterday's lesson really comes in handy. So prime factors of 8, okay? So we know that 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8, and they're all prime numbers. Prime factors of 20 is 2 times 2 times 5. So just like we did in the first method, we're going to look for everything that they have in common, okay? And you can see that all the prime factors that are common to both numbers. So 2, 2, 2, and 2, 2. So we have a lot of 2's going on here, right? So what we're going to do is we need the 3 2's, okay? This one has 2 2's, so that already kind of cancels it out. So we need at least the 3 2's, okay? So when I do that, 5/8 and 7/20 is 2 times 2 times 2 times 5, and that equals 40. So an equivalent fraction, okay, so remember we can't leave this guy out here, an equivalent fraction, then we go back to the original problem and we have to figure out what is the equivalent fraction for 5/8. What is that equal to if my denominator was now 40 instead of 8, okay? So, and again, the number that you multiply by has to be the same both on top and on bottom for the numerator and the denominator. So in this case, we would be using 5 because I know that 8 times 5 equals 40. And I would do the same for the top, and you get an answer of, correct, 25/40. So down here, we're now at 20 times what number will give me 40? I know that is 2. And again, if I'm multiplying by 2 my denominator, I need to do the same for my numerator. Okay. If you guys look here, 2 over 2 essentially is equal to 1 whole. Okay. So that means that if what I'm multiplying by, right, they should be the same. I'm not changing it. I'm multiplying it by itself essentially to give us a bigger number. Okay. So 7 times 2 would give me 14/40. Okay, so I also think of it like this. If I were to go back to 7/20, what would I need to do if I were to go back to 7/20? I no longer want to call it 14/40, but I want to go back to 7/20. You're just doing the opposite of what we just did, which is instead of multiplying by 2, you would end up dividing by 2. And that's how we get our simplest fraction, okay? And oftentimes, fractions are written not in simplest form, and this is how you would go about doing that, okay? Again, reinforcing my answers, 25/40 here, and 14/40 here. Okay, you can take a pause for questions or anything that needs to be reinforced. Here, let's do a couple more together before you guys are sent off into your breakout rooms. So we're going to use a common denominator to write an equivalent fraction for each fraction, and you guys just learned many different methods. So for number 1, when you find the common denominator, you should have gotten, and you can pause here and discuss, 15. And when you figure out what 1/3 turns into in terms of 15ths, that's 5/15, and 1/5 changes to 3/15. For number 2, the common denominator is 9. And when you find the equivalent fraction of those, it's 6/9 and 5/9. And for number 3, the common denominator is 45. And 2/9 would equal 10/45. And 1/15 would equal 3/45. Okay. For the next, So today for breakout rooms, number 1, you're going to meet with Miss Rupa. 2, you're going to complete problems number 4 through 14 even. And number 3, you'll be completing problems number 5 through 13 and rotating through.